Hello and welcome back. I'll be doing a special longer episode today, a glass chess set, here on the Jasa channel. And so I'll be starting off here with a 13 millimeter borosilicate rod. Borosilicate is considered a hard glass compared to your soft glass called soda lime, which is your everyday use glass. And so this being a hard glass means it's a little more stable, a little more resistant to cracking. But it does take some extra heat to melt, so this can be a bit of a time-consuming process. So I hope you stick with me and let me make you a few pieces here. I'll be starting off with the pawn, which is your first line of defense. It's also the lowest ranking piece. On a 64 square checkered board, the pawns are normally placed in the second row, 8 of them for each player. And now they have a very limited range of movement, only 1 square forward, and they can only capture another piece 1 square diagonally. And so each player takes turns moving 1 piece at a time. You can attempt to capture your opponent's pieces, which then are removed from the board. But the game itself cannot be completed until one of the player's kings arrives at a checkmate. More about that later in the video. And so I went ahead and gathered up a large sphere and flattened it out into a disc. And then attached a cold punty to the disc, which will become the base of the pawn. I need to make sure it's very straight and level, or else when I work on the rest of the piece, it may become off-centered. And now I'll flame cut a couple inches down to give me a small section of clear glass to apply some color to. This is going to be a black piece. Now there are some additional rules to the pawn. If the pawn hasn't moved yet in the current game, then it can move 2 spaces on its first move instead of 1. Also, if the pawn is able to reach the opposite end of the board, it can be immediately promoted to a higher ranking piece. You can choose any piece except for a king or another pawn. The queen is usually the most obvious choice. You can even have as many queens as you want, as long as those pawns reach the opposite end of the board. And now I'm just gathering the end up a little bit, just to get rid of that taper and have it more of a blunt cylinder. And begin to apply some amber purple striking color. Striking colors are a specially formulated color with elements of precious metals, especially gold and silver. As they heat up, they begin to react to the atmosphere they're in and change color. And so by changing the ratio of oxygen to fuel in your flame, you can adjust the colors you get. And so the amber purple will either be a earthy amber tone, a lot of yellowish red color, or it may strike to a very deep purple or beautiful iridescent blue. And so you can use the flame to strike in the color and target more specific areas that you want darker or lighter, or use the kiln and strike the entire thing at once. I'm laying down some lines. I'm doing them right off the rod. You can definitely pull out a stringer. That should give you more precision. I'll go ahead and pull a small stringer off the end of the piece here to fill in some of the smaller gaps. I do have a stringer pull video if you're interested in that technique. And so I've been practicing and working on this project for a while. Chess is a very popular and respected game, so I wanted to take it very serious and not only make some nice pieces, but a full set as well that I can play with and practice. I'm not very experienced with chess myself. I just learned the basics when I was younger. But with that said, I don't think you could be too young to learn either. I just started teaching my nieces using this set just the other day. My youngest niece is only 5 right now, but I could tell that she was really interested to learn, and she was starting to pick it up a little bit too. And now I'm going to go ahead and twist these lines up using my tweezers. I could attach a punty, that would be a little more effective, but sometimes I just change it up here and there, kind of work off the cuff. And now I'm just pulling a little bit of glass out to pull all the lines towards the end and have them connect at the top. And now you can see I have quite a few pawns made already. Some of them are a little bit different than the others. A little bigger head or shorter body. It's actually very difficult to make similar objects by hand. It's good to compare the objects back and forth to make sure they're the right size. But when you're trying to replicate something in glass, like an animal or a cartoon character, it's always a good idea to bring that object into your studio or a couple nice images. That way you can constantly look at them to compare. And so I didn't bring any chess pieces in with me. I'm doing it all from memory. I know the pawns normally do have a ring below their heads to help pick them up. But I decided to skip that step for now on the pawns, just to make the process a little more simple. I wanted to focus largely on the shape and color also. I made some green and blue ones, but found the amber purple worked the best. I might make another set using more traditional white and black glass, but really the sky's the limit here on this project. Any shape, color, or technique you can think of. I was actually planning to put white and black encased opals in the heads, but I thought I'd start off a little simpler. And so I'm just using gravity here to pull out the body. And I forgot to mention I was focusing the flame largely on the foot of the pawn. That way it pulls out a nice taper all the way from the base. And so I'm really liking the shape of this pawn. The last thing to do is flatten the bottom so it'll stand upright. This can actually be a little difficult to do. As the glass transitions from a liquid to solid state, it's a very quick process. And so it's very easy to have the glass drip a little bit and have things get weird. And so here's 5 of my pawns that didn't strike dark enough. I'm going to throw them back in the kiln and get them a bit darker. And here you can see they've changed quite a bit. Very rich purples, beautiful blue hues, and even some of that amber color mixed into the swirls. And so I was able to finish up all the pawns and the other half of the clear set. I started to realize I was running low on my 13mm rods. I wouldn't have enough to finish the black set. And so I thought rather than using mostly clear glass to build the pieces, instead I'll gather some of the amber purple color on both ends to make the base and the head. So not only should that help me stretch the 13mm, but give the pieces the more distinctive look for the darker set. And besides that, my next closest clear rod is only 9mm. I could attempt to finish the project with, but it makes it a little more difficult, especially forming the base. The 13mm rod has a wider area as it pushes down, so it's less likely to indent inside of the gather as the 9mm does. And now I found a small benefit to using this colored glass versus the clear when it comes to sculpting and shaping. It's a bit more stiff, almost like a dough, where the clear glass will move around like water. And so that stiffer material will hold its shape a little better and allow you to carve in a little more detail. I'm forming up the base now for this piece. I'm going a little slower, a little more incrementally. And so I'll go ahead and attach a punty to the base, flame cut another couple inches, and gather up some more amber purple for the head. It's going to be the most detailed piece in the set. It will require a lot of carving. Can you guess what it is? It will be the knight. The knight traditionally takes the shape of a horse's head and neck. It consists of a lot of detail, and so it's the most time-consuming piece for me to do. And again, doing this from memory is going to be difficult, especially since I don't normally sculpt horses. But I do love a challenge. I think that's what pushes me a lot with these videos and the lampworking process in general. I definitely feel that lampworking has kind of improved my position in life. But now to find the position of the knight on the chessboard, you'll have two of them right next to the rook. The two rooks are located in the corners. They look like small castles, and so the knights are right next to those. The knight does have a couple special movement rules. The first is that it's the only piece that can jump over other pieces. All the other pieces move in straight lines, and so they can easily get blocked by their own or their opponent's pieces. They also move in a special L-shaped pattern. It's kind of hard to see it at first. You have to get used to it a little bit. That's one of the ones my niece had trouble with the most. More technically, it's 2 vertical spaces and 1 horizontal space, or 1 horizontal space and 2 vertical spaces. And so it forms the shape of an L or a 7. It might not have as much range or power as some of the other pieces, but it's extra versatile as it can jump its way into position. It's the only piece on the back row that can be played in the first turn. I believe they call that the opening or opening move. As I understand, it can actually be a very important move, as what piece you choose and where you put it might change the strategies later in the game. Chess is very strategy heavy. Some people do spend a lot of time practicing and memorizing different moves and strategies. And now I'm just going into the basic rules to get you started. As I said before, I'm not very experienced with the game. I remember playing my brother quite a few times when I was younger. I'm pretty sure he won every single game. That or either it went to a draw. There was this one time, though, that I actually did study the board a little bit and the moves and came up with a little strategy, a plan. And it was probably just a phenomenal amount of luck, but it was the only time I actually won against him. It was a pretty quick win, too. So I went ahead and melted in the lines and used a lot of heat and gravity to pull it out into the right width of cylinder. It's now back to the 13mm where I started, but it's not long enough. I'm going to add a little more amber purple to the top where the head will be. And now if you're new to the channel, I want to welcome you and thank you for checking this video out. I do artistic projects like these, but also scientific experiments. And so I'm on what you may call a artistically scientific endeavor. If you're enjoying what you've seen so far, make sure to hit that like button, but most importantly, make sure to hit the subscribe button. I definitely want you back to see what's coming up on the channel. I don't want to go on this adventure by myself. That would be a lonely journey. But now for this little horse's journey, I'm going to start sculpting his face. I can kind of remember the general details, a very long head, the pointed ears on top. I'm also pushing on the sides to nudge that glass forward to kind of elongate the face. Kind of working on the nose and the eyes here a little bit. I haven't practiced a lot of sculpting, so it's going to take me a bit for this little guy. There's kind of two ways you can go about it. You can keep adding little bits of glass at a time to build the features. Or what I'm doing here, starting with a sphere and kind of jabbing and carving in the little details as I go. I'm starting over on the ear section now, trying to push a little glob of glass over and sculpt it into a little triangle. And so one of the common questions that comes up is, what does it take and cost to get into lampworking like this? And it's not the same answer for everyone. It does depend on your location a little bit, how much your oxygen and fuel will cost, along with shipping costs if you live in a more isolated location like Hawaii. But generally, a starting torch, which will produce a flame very similar to the one you're seeing here, is around $200. But then after that, you have ventilation, hoses, fittings, safety equipment like glasses and fire extinguisher. And so it can be anywhere from an extra $300 to $400, and that's even before you've gotten tools or glass. I always recommend to secure your oxygen first. That's the biggest variable. When in doubt, go with the oxygen concentrator. There's sort of a miracle here in the lampworking field. But for tools, you can start off very simple, like with this butter knife and my tweezers, and then collect more as you go. And for the kiln, I always recommend just practicing for a while and buy that later once you figure out what you want to make. It may be a little extra challenging starting out without a kiln, but sometimes a challenge is what we need. You have to fail a few times in order to learn how to win. The same goes for chess. And now I'm going to sculpt in a very tiny mouth. I think he's looking pretty cute. He's my most detailed horse yet. I'll admit my nieces thought these were dogs, not horses, so I do have some work ahead of me. But that's what the flame working journey is all about. Slowly progressing and building up your skills day by day, trying to get to where you want to be. You can't be too focused on the end game. I mean, it definitely helps to have the later parts of your life planned out and in focus, but at the same time, the early parts will just pass you by. And that's the majority of the journey. You know, once you reach the end of the adventure, then what do? It just gets boring. And so I just keep trying to tell myself to have fun with it. Try not to worry too much about the watch time and view count. I really enjoy seeing new subscribers though. It's awesome to know you want to join along with what I do here. And I hope you're having fun with me, watching this little horse dog come to life. I'm working on the mane right now, sculpting in little lines on his back. And I definitely feel like I can get more lines on this color glass than the clear glass because of that stiffness I was talking about earlier. And so when I'm doing a new project, I normally like to do a lot of research beforehand. That way I have a good idea of what needs to be done and maybe be able to give you some cool facts while I'm at it. And so instead of doing the research on this project, I basically just watched The Queen's Gambit on Netflix. And I thought it was pretty good. I was a little surprised how entertaining it was, being kind of a simple story about chess. I think the settings and the sceneries were one of the biggest highlights. It was based in the 60s, so it had that older timey kind of feel to it. But then the acting was pretty good also. And now it is rated mature, which is 17 plus, in case you happen to be a younger viewer. But I wouldn't be too worried about missing it, unless you happen to be a real chess enthusiast, and then you might really like it. And so here's the finished knight. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. The last step here will be to tap him off the punty and flatten the base so he sits upright. And a good thing to mention is that the metal tools are very thermally conductive, which means they soak up or transfer heat very quickly. And so when you're grabbing onto your work like this, you have to be careful cooling down that spot too much, or else it could cause it to crack. And so it can be a good idea to brush your tools in the flame for a moment to warm them up. Not too much, however, as you might damage the tool. Next up will be the Rook, which looks like a small castle. The shaping and sculpting on this one is going to be a lot more simple. I plan to square off the top of the piece and then just cut a deep plus into it. I'll try to groove it out a little bit to create those battlements at the top. I believe those are the empty sections at the top of the castle that the archer shoots down between and kind of gets protection from. And now I'm using my clear rooks here as a guide to make sure I've got the shape and the proportions the same. They don't have to look like classical chess pieces. Like I said before, you can really do whatever you want here. But they should at least look similar in the same glass chess set. I know in this set, one of my rooks ended up with a much darker top because it ended up striking a little bit more during the process. And that was mainly just from the steps I took to make the pieces. In one of the rooks, I gathered up the glass for the head before I twisted the lines. While in the other one, I gathered the glass after I twisted it up, so it had less time to strike. And so as I mentioned before, the rooks can be located in the very corners of the board. Each player starts with 2 of them. And there's a pawn directly in front of the rooks, so they start the game blocked and can't move. It takes a while to get them into play. But once they get the opportunity to get into position, they do make a very powerful piece. They move in a horizontal or vertical direction and can sweep all the way across the board in one move. It's one of those opponent's pieces that are very easy to lose track of being so far away. And before you know it, they're putting your king in check from across the board. I'm putting a lot of heat into the top of the rook and sculpting some deep lines into it. I'm going to come back again and continue those lines a little bit down the sides too. You might have noticed I do tend to work on the hotter side of the spectrum. I like to keep it very hot to make very quick marks and adjustments, but not so hot that those features begin to melt out. And now I'm going to go ahead and re-flatten the sides and the top to make sure it's more angular and less round. And I usually like to hit it in the flame just a little bit to get any tool marks out. You'll tend to get some ripples when it comes to the pressing process. And if you're not careful with your tweezers and you grab it when it's too hot, you'll leave little indentions in the glass. And so again, I'll knock this one off my punty and finish up the base. I'm really happy with the choice for the amber purple on this project. I think it's really on point. But I'm actually a little bit on the fence with the clear glass. Being transparent, they're just hard to see. And now if you're curious about where to get amber purple, you have a few different options. There's one company called Glass Alchemy. They call their amber purple Triple Passion. And then Troutman Art Glass will refer to it as Mai Tai. Lastly, North Star calls it simply amber purple. And so each company kind of makes the same striking color, but with different variations, different kind of formulas. But they all tend to be a bit more expensive than something like a simple cobalt blue. Around $60 a pound. You can buy them in smaller quantities, but it's cheaper to go for the full pound, and it's good to wait for the sales too. And so now we're gonna diagonally move into the bishop. And so this bishop is gonna look very similar to the pawn, except a bit taller and with a more of an oval shaped head. It's traditionally noticeable for the line or groove in the top of the piece, which at the time, doing it from memory, I couldn't quite remember what it looked like. And so I ended up putting it on the center, whereas it's normally slanted along the side. And so the bishop operates very similar to the rook. However, instead of going in horizontal and vertical directions, it prefers to travel diagonally. Unlike the rook, it begins a little less blocked in. It only requires one move of a pawn to bring it out onto the board. The rook, on the other hand, may take a couple moves to get around the pawn. And so a bishop can be a little more versatile earlier in the game. Each player begins with two bishops located directly next to the knights, opposite of the rooks. And now I'm focusing a lot of heat again between the base and the body of the piece. I'm going to pull out a very nice taper. You can also attach a punty and try to pull it out by hand, but this is my preferred method to use gravity instead. When you're spinning it horizontally while it's molten, if your timing is off, then gravity is going to end up pulling it off center. And that usually happens to me when I switch between hands. It goes off center just a little bit. But now when I hold it down towards the floor, gravity just pulls it straight down. And so it has no way to really pull it off center. And then comparing to my clear bishop to make sure it's the right height. Again, I'm tapping off the punty and then going back in to melt out that little punty mark left over. Next up is the most powerful piece in the game, the queen. The midsection will be similar to the bishop, but the top will have two discs with a smaller tapered section in between. And now the queen has the largest range of movement. Like the rook, she can move all the way across the board, horizontally and vertically. But she can move diagonally also, like the bishop. Each player starts the game with a single queen, but can receive more if a pawn is promoted. If you don't have an additional queen piece, you can turn a rook upside down and try to use that. And now before I push the Marias, the glass discs, I have to pull the glass out a little thinner to about 7 millimeters. Or else I won't be able to drive enough heat into it quick enough, and it'll start to gather up into more of a marble. This torch and the low pressure oxygen concentrator is good for a nice even heat, but not as well for a very hot and pinpoint flame. But if you can't get a nice pinpoint flame, you can always brush it against the edge of the flame too. Sometimes that works. And so I'll keep rotating and concentrating a lot of heat into one spot and begin to push together with both hands. This will begin to form up a disc shape, and oh, I just broke it off the punty. So mistakes like that can happen. I normally recommend using more heat than more force. But other than that, when I'm working with a colder punty, I normally try not to hover it over anything flammable or myself, especially. I did mess up the alignment a little bit in the head by dropping it, but that's okay. I'll try to correct it here. And I'll try to push that disc a little bit larger. And as I said before, you do start out with one queen, and she's located right next to the king, who always begins the game on the opposite square of the color you're playing. And so the white king starts on the black square, whereas the black king begins on the white square. I'm going to heat up this small gather of glass on the top of the queen and give it a little push to make another disc. This is going to form the top section of what I'm assuming is a crown, but I'm not done yet. I'm going to come back in here with my trusty sculpting tool, the butter knife, and begin to apply some ridges all the way around the crown, giving it more of an angular shape. Another way to differentiate between the pieces is by height. The king should be the largest piece, the queen second to that, and then the other pieces will be progressively smaller, working your way out to the rooks, and then finally the pawns should probably be the smallest. I've just noticed that as a common trend among chess sets. And then I'll just flatten it out one more time, and then I'll go into the base to give it that slender pull. Another great demonstration of this technique would be the glass spinner top video. I made some spinning tops, tested them all out, had a little spin top battle. But I'm thinking the shaping is looking good here. I'm just going to finish up the bottom and move on to the very last one, which of course is the king. And so I decided to shape the king pretty similar to the queen. The largest difference is the round sphere on top of his head. And so more traditionally, they'll use a cross instead. But since I'm a marble maker and all, figured a little sphere would be cool. And now I'll be going straight in on the top here, as this is going to be the first all clear piece in the video. I need to pull out that cylinder into a thinner diameter, similar to the queen, and then push in those Marias, those discs. And then I'll punty up to the end of it with another clear rod. And so I buy my clear glass in bulk also to save some money, some shipping cost. It comes in a very big bulk though. It might be a little much for a beginner. The crates are about 35 pounds for around $200. That's including the shipping costs. But then it'll usually go on sale, especially at Mountain Glass Arts, for anywhere from 30 to 40% off. They do it 2 or 3 times a year. I don't really keep track. And so as I said before, you're only allowed 1 king per game, and he begins on the opposite color that you're playing. And so real quick, I remember teaching my niece the different pieces, and before I got to the king, I asked her if she could guess how it could move looking at the other pieces. And she's pretty smart. She noticed that they were getting more powerful as they're going, and since the queen can go almost anywhere, her guess was that the king can jump to any square at once, which is kind of what you'd expect, especially of a king, but it's quite the opposite. He can only move 1 square, very similar to the pawn, but he can go in any direction, even backwards. There are some extra rules with the king, as he's the main object of the game. He can't be moved into a square that is threatened by your opponent's pieces. This will automatically put him in what's called check. And once you're in check, you can't make any moves other than ones that will allow you to escape the threatened square, capture the enemy piece, putting you in check, or even block the check with one of your other pieces if available. And so in the top left example, the purple king could capture the green queen to escape check. And now pawns can't move backwards, but if it happened to have been 1 square back, then it would be protecting the queen. And so she can no longer be captured as the king can't enter a threatened square. And being that she threatens all the remaining squares that the king could move into, it becomes a checkmate and a game over. And now in the bottom left example, we have a green knight that is threatening the king, putting him in check. And since none of the other pieces can reach the knight, the king's only option would be to move diagonally to escape check. And now if we look in the bottom right, the addition of 1 green pawn will threaten the king's escape route. And so we have that along with the king's own pieces blocking him in the corner. Will put him in checkmate, which can be a good reminder not to block yourself in with your own pieces. And so the very last rule we'll be checking out here is called castling. It's a very specific rule that comes with a lot of caveats. As one of your moves, you can immediately exchange the king and one of your rooks. They call this castling. And now, in order to castle, both pieces can't have moved yet in the game. There also has to be a clear path between the 2 pieces, so none of your pieces can get in the way. And lastly, it can't be achieved if the opponent is threatening one of the squares that the king has to cross. And I know it sounds ultra specific, but I'm not sure how often castling is actually used. I just thought I would add it in case you think someone's trying to pull a fast one on you, move some pieces around that shouldn't. And so with the basic rules covered, I recommend you try the game out yourself. See if you can find an opponent that's equally matched. But you might be able to find some online games too. Play someone over the internet. And now that I've finished up the rules, I'm going to finish up the last step on this king. And then we can check out all this work. And here they are. They're looking pretty cool. It took a little extra time, but that's what it's really all about. The next set I make will be better than this one, and then the next one after that will probably be even better than that one. It's all about practice and consistency also. If you stop practicing some of these techniques, you may get a bit rusty. But now I'll show you that one strategy that helped me beat my brother. I began by moving my pawn out 2 spaces. He responded the same. And then I advanced my bishop forward to the mid area of the board. He responded by bringing out his knight. I steadily snuck my queen out while he was still focused on that bishop. So he moved his knight into position to capture it next round. However, before that could happen, I swept my queen across the board, captured a surprise pawn, and threw his king into checkmate. And now we've reached the end of this video on the glass chess set. I definitely will make another set with some more detail. But I want to thank you for watching and tuning in here on the Matt Jasa channel.